Good day. In this program, once more, I return to the perennial topic of these programs, which is the conflict in Ukraine, where it must be said that things are now reaching a kind of boiling point, or at least a situation where one senses that major events are about to happen. Joseph Borrell, the EU's, well, let's call him foreign minister, high representative on foreign policy, foreign affairs and security, has said that he's not optimistic in his expectations about how this conflict may develop over the summer. Not optimistic means that he feels that the situation is going badly for Ukraine. And so it seems to me is the case. Now, these enormous Russian missile and drone offensives, which we have been witnessing over the course of May, continue unabated. We've had more missile strikes on Kiev, including apparently an attack on some kind of facility, which caused an explosion on such an enormous scale that it caused earth tremors, which were registered, which register on the Richter scale. Apparently, this was a huge explosion which took place in the Kiev area. Just a few minutes ago, just as I was preparing for this program, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed certain comments made earlier by Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, that the Russians have also attacked in Kiev a decision-making center or centers. Not entirely clear what this means, but the Defense Ministry has conveyed the impression that this attack focused on the buildings that house those agencies that have been responsible for some of these attacks that Ukrainian organizations have been undertaking in Russia. The recent incursion into Belgorod, the various bomb attacks, assassinations, drone attacks, such things. And we haven't had huge amount of information about this. The Russians haven't told us, as I said, which agency was involved, but it does seem that there have been major traffic jams in Kiev around the building that houses the Interior Ministry. So it's likely that that was one of the structures, one of the buildings that was attacked, but it could be that there were others as well. Anyway, lots of attacks on Kiev, but not just on Kiev. Attacks right across Ukraine, and even as I am making this program, more reports of more attacks, more Russian missile and drone attacks coming. I've just seen a report that ships of the Russian Black Sea Fleet are now maneuvering into position, preparing to launch their Calibre cruise missiles, apparently for a further attack on Ukraine. And of course, the Russian Air Force has been busy as well. There have been lots of strikes, missile strikes, with aircraft, airborne cruise missiles, again, right across Ukraine. Most of these attacks, as far as I can say, are now taking place with little in the way of interference by the Ukrainian air defense system, which is now, or so it seems to me, largely concentrated on trying to protect and defend Kiev. And by the way, in Kiev, lots of pictures of buildings. The mayor of Kiev, Mayor Klitschko, is warning people to remain indoors or to go to bomb shelters. There's rather distressing pictures of people, including young people, children in some cases, in shelters, in the metro system. Thankfully, There don't seem to be many civilian casualties as a result of these attacks, as a consequence of the steps that the Ukrainian authorities are taking to tell people to stay indoors or underground, but also, and I have to say this, I suspect in part because the Russian authorities are concentrating their missile and bombing strikes on locations that, from their point of view, have a military significance. They don't seem to be targeting civilians. But anyway, it's nonetheless affecting to see these people huddling in their bomb shelters as the missiles and the rockets and the drones fall. And this has been going on for days, and it means that people's sleep patterns are becoming disrupted. And of course, there's understandable fear and understandable stress. There's even a picture now of the former Ukrainian President Poroshenko, hiding in a bomb shelter with people nearby, looking pale and stressed. I ought to say that Russian channels have not been able to resist reminding everyone of a speech, a notorious speech that Poroshenko delivered back in 2014, in which he compared the fate of people in Donbass with people in the rest of Ukraine. He made comments such as to the effect that whilst children in Donbass would huddle in bomb shelters, children in Ukraine would be able to go to school. That was what he said in 2014, at a time when it should be stressed the conflict was still very much underway, and at a time when it was Ukraine that had secure control of the air. Well, the Russians, perhaps unsurprisingly, in light of those comments, are now drawing attention to the fact that it's Poroshenko who is now hiding in a bomb shelter. I personally find these pictures affecting, as I said, distressing, but they do give one a strong sense of the scale of what is happening in and around Kiev. And my impression is that alongside these attacks on these decision-making centers and on these important facilities that Ukraine has in Kiev, whatever they are, part of the purpose that the Russians are pursuing in conducting these missile and drone strikes is to deplete even further the Ukrainian air defense system, which at least in Kiev seems now to be almost entirely based, as far as I can see, on Western missiles, on Western air defense systems. And the mayor of Kiev, Mayor Klitschko, has actually warned people of the danger of debris, which is an admission, or so it seems to me, that some of the missiles that fall in residential areas are either presumably drones or missiles that the Ukrainians have shot down, Russian drones or missiles that the Ukrainians have shot down, or quite often drones and missiles that Ukraine has launched into the sky that have either malfunctioned or failed to hit a target and have themselves fallen back to earth. And I've noticed that at least in Kiev, because these missiles that fall, these Western missiles that fall, which are the air defense missiles that Ukraine itself has launched. Anyway, it seems to me that there's been fewer claims of Russian attacks on residential buildings than we have seen, because as these are Western missiles, it's more difficult to pass them off as Russian missiles, S-300s and all that. I've discussed the way in which Ukraine has tried to spin some of the strikes on residential buildings as S-300 missiles used by Russia as surface-to-surface missiles. Anyway, we've heard less of that this time because, as I said, it's quite clear that some of these missiles are indeed Western missiles, which have either fallen to Earth because they've missed their targets or which have malfunctioned in some way. And I have seen pictures of what appear to be Patriot missiles, debris from Patriot missiles amongst them. Though I say that, I should make it very clear that when I identify this missile debris is from Patriot missiles, I have to base that on what others say, since of course I'm not able myself to distinguish a Patriot missile system from another missile system. But anyway, much of that has been going on. And we've also had reports of Russian attacks on the same airfield where the Patriot missile system was based, which the Russians attacked about a week ago. Now, that was the Patriot missile system which supposedly shot down 6 Kinzhal missiles. That's the official Ukrainian view, endorsed by some in the West, or in the alternative, the one that the Russians say was at least partially destroyed with the loss of 1 radar system and 5 launchers. Well, Simplicius the Thinker has now published a further piece on this particular issue of whether or not the Patriot missile system was successfully destroyed, as the Russians claim, or at least in part, or whether it was the Kinzhal missiles instead that got shot down. And he's published satellite photos of this particular airfield, which show the situation there before the attack and some days after. And as he correctly points out, at least this is how I read these photos, you can clearly see there big impact craters, which realistically can only have been caused by incoming missiles. In other words, some incoming missiles, presumably Kinzhal missiles, got through. Now, what they destroyed, I can't say. These satellite photos don't show that. Presumably the destroyed launchers and radar, if they were indeed there, were removed from the scene. But something presumably was hit, and I don't see any reason to doubt that it was a Patriot missile system. Now, if there's been more attacks on this airbase, then presumably what the Russians are doing is hunting whatever left of this Patriot missile system. Apparently there's a fair number of batteries still operational, but I'm not able to guesstimate this, but presumably they're still hunting that Patriot missile system and any other systems that have been positioned on this airbase, either to protect the Patriot itself, which would be ironic, by the way, but it does happen, or perhaps to substitute for Patriot launchers which have been destroyed. So anyway, that's the overall picture from the missile strikes. I've focused very heavily on the situation in Kiev, but of course it's important to stress again that these attacks are taking place all over Ukraine, and they've been happening every single day in what is by far the most intense air and missile campaign that the Russians have conducted up to this time. So that's one piece of news about what's going on in the war. We've also now had some comments from the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, and I'm going to quote some of what he said from the TASS news agency. And he said, apparently at a meeting in the Defense Ministry, the Russian Defense Ministry, he said Russian forces continue to inflict an effective fire impact on the enemy. Its losses this month alone totaled over 16,000 troops, 16 aircraft, 5 helicopters, 466 drones, over 400 tanks and other armoured combat vehicles, and 238 field artillery pieces and mortars, 196 HIMARS rockets, 16 HARM rockets, and 29 Storm Shadow long-range cruise missiles were intercepted and destroyed during the reviewed period. Now, this is a pretty astonishing number of men and machines that Shoigu says Ukraine lost over the course of May. Note one rather curious fact. He says that over the course of May, Ukraine lost 466 drones. Well, of course, in the West, we've been reading that, RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, is one of them that has said this. In the West, we've been reading that Ukraine is losing 300 drones a day. So this is one instance when Shoigu appears to be giving a significantly lower figure for Ukrainian drone losses than sources in the West are. I suspect that Shoigu is counting drones differently. He's probably only counting the bigger, more advanced drones, or perhaps he's counting the ones that were actually shot down rather than the drones that were brought down through electronic warfare techniques, which these publications in the West tell us account for by far the greater proportion of these losses. But anyway, let's just consider those figures. 16,000 troops. Ukraine has lost 16,000 troops. Now, he isn't saying 16,000 Ukrainian troops were killed. Lost would include dead and injured, but it is nonetheless a horrendous rate of loss. It's in the region of 500 a day. And when Shoigu talks about Ukraine when losing 16,000 troops, I get the impression that he doesn't just mean dead and wounded, he means dead and severely wounded, so that they can't participate any longer in the fighting. Well, that would be consistent with Russian claims that Ukrainian losses have been spiking ever since the start of the new year, and that in fact, since the Battle of Bakhmut started in earnest, that Ukrainian losses have been rising and are now rising at extremely fast rates and extremely high levels. I think I am right in saying that the figure of 16,000 is the highest number that the Russians claim of Ukrainian troops that the Russians claim to have put out of action since March last year, when the Russians first began their operation. I think that in March they claim to have killed and wounded, in March last year they claimed to have killed and wounded perhaps a similar number of Ukrainian troops to the number that we see here. But anyway, that's what Shoigu says, and perhaps even more interesting is the toll that the Russian air defense system is, according to Shoigu, exacting on Ukraine's long-range missile capabilities. So 196 HIMARS rockets. And we've again had confirmation about much of this in the Western media, that the Russians are successfully jamming the GPS signals to the HIMARS rockets, that the Russian air defenses are now increasingly succeeding in shooting down HIMARS rockets, that the effectiveness of the HIMARS system has very significantly declined since it was first deployed back in August of last year. And 16 HARM rockets. Now these are anti-radar rockets launched by aircraft. There's been much discussion about the effectiveness of these HARM rockets. The general consensus, both on the Russian side, but also from various publications in the West, is that these rockets are proving ineffectual. Ukraine has been launching them, but without a great deal of success. But note what Shoigu says about the Storm Shadow. He says that the Russians have now shot down 29 Storm Shadow missiles. Now, the British only confirmed that Storm Shadow missiles had been delivered to Ukraine a couple of weeks ago, and Ukraine started to use them in earnest. My recollection is about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it looks like the Russians are not, in that relatively short space of time, have not only managed, according to Shoigu at least, to shoot down 29 of these missiles, but the impression I'm getting from Russian claims is that the Russians believe that the number of missiles, of these Storm Shadow missiles, that they are shooting down is increasing. Of course, we don't know how many Storm Shadow missiles Britain has supplied to Ukraine. But according to the Russians, increasingly they are failing to get through. They're being shot down. And for the record, I think the Russians are right about this. So, a very, very difficult month altogether May has been for Ukraine. It's lost Bakhmut. According to Shoigu, it's lost large numbers of men, 16,000 killed and wounded. It's lost over 400 tanks and other armoured vehicles. We don't know how that divides. The Russians never distinguish in these ballpark figures between tanks and armoured vehicles, combat vehicles, though there is an important distinction to be made there. They've lost, according to Shoigu, 238 field artillery pieces and mortars. Again, we don't know how one separates the two from each other. And increasingly, their HIMARS systems are not working properly. Their HARM rockets are not working properly. The Storm Shadow is not proving the decisive weapon that Ukraine perhaps hoped it would be. And last but not least, as we've seen, the Russians launching these enormous attacks every day now across Ukraine, targeting Kiev very heavily, driving people both day and night into bomb shelters, disrupting their sleep, attacking facilities in Kiev. We don't fully know what those facilities are. They claim, and I think they're almost certainly correct, doing massive damage to the Patriot system that was delivered to Ukraine, perhaps doing more damage to the Western supplied air defense system operating around Kiev, which is becoming increasingly depleted itself. And according to the Russians today, for the first time, attacking one at least, perhaps more, of the decision-making centres. So it must be said, so far May has been a very hard month for Ukraine. Now, that brings me back briefly, and I'm going to discuss this very briefly now, to the topic of General Zaluzhny and his curious absence. I received an email from someone who has considerable experience of these things. He's seen the film, the video of Zaluzhny, and he's taken the view that it could be consistent with somebody who suffered some degree of trauma, perhaps from a shell strike or something like that. And he goes through all the reasons why. It's all convincing. He says that, there's Zaluzhny doesn't seem to be moving his limbs very well. He seems to be sitting. One occasion when the impression is given that he's standing, it seems that he is nonetheless sitting. And it could be that he has indeed been injured in some way. Against that, Simplicius the thinker takes the view that that Zaluzhny is probably all right, and that the whole story of him being injured was some kind of presumably Russian psychological warfare operation. I'm going to come up with the third explanation, one which, so far as I know, no one has given up to now, which is that Zaluzhny is presumably well informed about what's going on the battlefronts, and it could be that he's straightforwardly depressed, that he's seeing all of these events, he's seeing the army that he's supposed to lead suffering these appalling losses, he's seen the gathering collapse, as far as I can see, of the air defense system. He's seeing the missile strikes across Ukraine, and that this has put him in a depressed mood. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that he's clinically depressed, but as somebody who's had problems with depression, I can say that some of his vacancy and unresponsiveness in this video would not be inconsistent with my own experience of depression. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this. I'm absolutely not going to push this far. I'm certainly not in a position to conduct diagnosis or medical analysis, and I just offer that as a possible explanation in the light of all that's going on. Well, even as Ukraine is being hammered with missiles and rockets and bombs on the battlefields, Ukraine has tried to respond, and it's just undertaken a very significant drone attack on Kiev. 32 drones, according to the Russian authorities. These were rather small drones. A few did get through, but they did minor damage, apparently, to a few buildings. There's no information that anybody has been seriously wounded. The Russian authorities are denying this. They claim that 19 of the drones were brought down one way or the other. Either electronic warfare mechanisms were again used. Sometimes, apparently, they were shot down by cannon and perhaps missiles and the Pantsir air defense systems located in and around Moscow. And in addition, the Russians also say that some of these drones were brought down because they crashed into power cables as they were flying at very low altitudes, or collided with trees, or did things like that. In other words, they were brought down, if you like, through natural means without human intervention. Anyway, I have to say this. The mayor of Kiev, Mayor Klitschko, has publicly complained to Zelensky that citizens of Kiev are being driven from their homes and their beds. They're not able to sleep. They're being bombed. And he's asked why the same isn't true of people in Moscow. Well, you can object to the sentiments in Mercouris's comments, but you can perhaps also understand those sentiments. And it does seem to me that this drone attack might have been intended to try to redress the balance, to satisfy people like Klitschko that Ukraine can retaliate to these enormous Russian missile and drone strikes, not just in Kiev, but across Ukraine. To my mind, however, what this drone strike has actually done is that it has exposed the extent of the imbalance. It shows that the Russians are able to launch missiles and drones to tremendous effect and on a scale that is far beyond Ukraine's capabilities, and that Ukraine, for its part, all that it can do is engage in minor pinprick attacks. And the drone strike on Moscow, which, by the way, is what most of the British media is leading on, they're not paying very much attention to the far more powerful Russian missile and drone strikes on Kiev and other places. Anyway, this drone strike on Moscow, this Ukrainian drone strike on Moscow, is, to my mind, a demonstration of futility and weakness. Now, saying all of this, I ought to say that there's been some suggestions, again, in the media in Britain, apparently, that the drones, the Ukrainian drones, were trying to target some of the wealthier residential areas of Moscow, that they might have been seeking to attack people close to President Putin, oligarchs, Russian oligarchs, and people of that kind. That they might even have been intended to target President Putin himself. I'm not sure that this is what the details of these articles are claiming, but I have seen some rather disturbing headlines to that effect. I've not wanted, to be honest, to read below them. Now, if that is what people in Britain think and what they want to see happen, drone strikes conducted by Ukraine, and I should say in parenthesis that Ukraine for the moment is sort of denying again that it is behind these drone strikes, though everybody knows that it is in fact Ukraine, that it is carrying out these drone strikes. I don't think we should continue with this fiction for much longer. But if the media in Britain and perhaps elsewhere in the West is happy that Ukraine is trying to use drone strikes against Moscow in order to effect assassinations, if that's the plan, well, all I can say about that is that we have again fallen very far below our former moral standards. Whatever you may think about these Russian drone strikes on Kiev and other places, and I have said that I find some of the pictures of people in shelters moving and affecting, but nonetheless, they do not seem to be intended to strike directly at the civilian population. And I find it disturbing that some people in Britain apparently are intensely relaxed and even pleased when Ukraine does try to do that. I'm not going to say more. I leave it to people's conscience. And as I said, if I've misunderstood the articles beneath these headlines, then all I can say is I apologise. But anyway, to proceed, this last comment, this last point, brings me to Senator Lindsey Graham, who's just, of course, been to Kiev. He's had meetings with President Zelensky, and there's video comments of him appearing in which he says that the killing of Russians means that the money that the United States has been providing to Ukraine is the best money that the United States could be spending. I mean, that was, I'm not paraphrasing his words exactly, but that's effectively what this film apparently says. Now, Senator Lindsey Graham has, I think, entirely correctly said that he said no such thing. He did mention killing Russians in some of the comments that he made over the course of this meeting with Zelensky, and he did talk about money well spent in another part of his comments. But what has happened is that somebody has conflated those two comments together to give the impression that they're somehow linked with each other when they are not in fact linked with each other. And some people, including some officials in Russia, have mocked Senator Lindsey Graham's explanation, but I think he's telling the truth. Reuters, that has looked at this, apparently sees that there has indeed been editing in the way in which Senator Lindsey Graham's comments have been published. Now, Senator Lindsey Graham says that this is all the work of Russian propaganda. But what he is apparently ignoring is that it seems that the film, with these two comments juxtaposed with each other in order to give the impression that they are part of the same phrase, apparently it was released by Ukraine. So if that is correct, and I believe it is, then all I could say is that Senator Lindsey Graham perhaps ought to reflect on that and reflect on who it seems is manipulating his words. I would also point out that he set himself up for this. Some months ago, he was speaking in a way that clearly conveyed his wish or belief that the US authorities should collude in the assassination of President Putin. So it's unsurprising that Ukraine and Russia have each made mileage of that from the sentiments that he expressed then by, well, in the one case perhaps manipulating his words, and in another case publicizing his words in ways that Senator Lindsey Graham doubtless finds embarrassing. I think if I can give him a word of advice, I would advise him to keep as far from Kiev as possible. The Russians, by the way, have issued an arrest warrant for him, which is, of course, simply them, I think, trying to make further mileage of this affair. I don't think they have any real intention of trying to arrest him. So, a very bleak picture overall for Ukraine over the last month. Now, all of these events with the missile strikes and the drone strikes on Moscow and all that have to some extent obscured news about what's actually going on the battlefronts. We've had reports from Yan Gagin. This is Pushilin's advisor, Denis Pushilin, the head of the Donetsk regional government. Gagin has said that Ukraine did attempt to carry out another counterattack in the area of Artyomovsk, a town which most of the world knows as Bakhmut, but which the Russians call Artyomovsk. But he says that this attack failed, that it was repelled, and that it was thrown back. And another one of our regular commentators, people who speak and discuss things for the Russian news agency TASS. Vladimir Rogov from Zaporozhye says that the Ukrainians are trying to fool the Russians to thinking that they're withdrawing troops from Zaporozhye region because they're moving their artillery and armoured forces from one place to another. I think it's more likely that they're trying to they're moving their armoured units in order to prevent the Russians locating where they are and launching missile and bomb strikes upon them. So I think that's the real reason why they are being shuffled around in the way that Rogov says. But Rogov continues to insist that there's 65,000 Ukrainian troops concentrated in Zaporozhye region. And he continues to think, and I know many people on the Russian side also think the same, that the Ukrainian offensive is now likely to be launched at any time. And by the way, and going back to the subject of Zaluzhny, yesterday, Zelensky said that he had another meeting with his top military officials. And he said that Zaluzhny and Syrskyi were both there. And the impression given from the bulletin that publicized this meeting was that this was all about the offensive. So it may be that this offensive is about to happen, but I would point out that we're now almost at the very end of May. If the offensive takes place over the next 24 hours, it will have been launched on the very last day of May. And that is already significantly later than we were led to believe earlier this year. I remember that back in January, when there was talk of supplying Ukraine with tanks, the suggestion was that the offensive would take place in March, then it was going to be April, then the Pentagon leaks told us that the start date was intended to be the 30th of April. Well, we're almost at the end of May now. It could be, as I said, that it will indeed be launched over the next day or so. Now, I talked about the ineffectiveness, the pointlessness of the Ukrainian drone attack on Moscow, and about the effectiveness of the Russian drone and missile attacks on Ukraine. It should be said that there are contrary views. The Economist has claimed that the missile and drone attacks on Kiev have been ineffective. I can't see that that is consistent with the information that we're seeing. Richard Kemp in the Daily Telegraph said that the Russian missile and drone attacks on Kiev are the product of Vladimir Putin's fear of the Ukrainian offensive, which is coming. He's so frightened by this offensive that apparently he's taking out his fear by pouring missiles and drones, launching drones and missiles at Kiev. Well, it is a point of view, though again, I think it wildly exaggerates Putin's operational control over this missile and drone offensive, which is surely being conducted by the Russian aerospace forces and by the Russian general staff, not by Putin himself. And as I said, it's actually quite possible to discern a military rationale behind this Russian missile and drone offensive, which is, as I said, taking place across Ukraine. And there's even been a Russian commentary which said that the drone attack on Moscow was intended to glean information about Moscow's air defenses. Now, I've heard this explanation given for many of these Ukrainian drone attacks, It's been an ongoing story since August. I have to say that this explanation has stretched too thin for me. I have no longer taken it very seriously. It seems to me that, on the contrary, these drone attacks are essentially of token or symbolic significance. They're carried out by Ukraine, not so much in order to inflict any real damage on the Russians or to somehow expose the realities of the Russian air defense system. Rather, what they're intended to do is to boost morale back in Ukraine itself, keep a narrative of Ukrainian success active in the media, the Western media, and also, and last but not least, to sow panic and worry amongst the Russian civilian population. It seems to me that is far and away the most likely explanation for these attacks. The Financial Times, however, has taken this even further. It's talked about how these daring attacks that Ukraine is launching are intended to overstretch Russian defenses and to keep the Russians guessing about where the Ukrainian offensive is going to come. Again, I have to say, I find that implausible, and besides, it overstates the scale and effectiveness of these pinprick attacks, which, as I said, appear to me to, as I said before, appear to me to be on a significantly lesser scale than attacks that Ukraine was launching behind the front lines in the summer of 2022 on the eve of the offensives in Kherson and Kharkiv region. After all, during those attacks, Ukraine did carry out significant damage to a Russian air base in Crimea, as I remember, and the HIMARS systems did indeed cause the Russians some difficulties when they were first used. These attacks are hardly, it seems to me, effective in that way, nor, incidentally, do they match the ambition of the attacks with the converted Strizh reconnaissance drones, these supersonic drones, Tupolev drones, of which Ukraine still had a few left over from the period of the Soviet Union, which Ukraine converted into long-range cruise missiles of a certain type. There were several attacks with these Strizh drones back in the autumn. They reached as far as the Engels Air Base, major base of Russian strategic aviation. We haven't heard of successful attacks with these Strizh drones for a while now. Perhaps there's still a few left. Perhaps the Ukrainians are hoarding them for use in their offensive. But in any event, these recent attacks by Ukraine don't seem to me to come close to matching what would really be needed to overstretch and extend and confuse the Russian defenders to any great degree. Now, saying all of this, I would just add something else, which is that the Russians appear to be beefing up their surveillance and intelligence gathering in Ukraine. Now, amongst the things that the revelations in the papers by the Royal United Services Institute, which have received little attention, one particular thing stood out for me, which is that the Russians have apparently succeeded, according to RUSI, in decrypting some Ukrainian communications. Apparently there's a particular system that the Ukrainians use, which the Russians have successfully decrypted. They've broken into it. And that enables them to keep track on some internal Ukrainian communications. That I would have thought was a major revelation. It might, by the way, explain why the Russians appear to have fairly accurate figures for Ukrainian losses, because it seems as if their signals intelligence is able to pick up reports. This is a guess now, but it follows in that RUSI report. Perhaps the Russian signals intelligence is able to pick up reports from Ukrainian field commanders, relaying back to Kiev, to the general staff there, the level of losses that they're experiencing following any particular Russian missile, artillery or airstrike. Just guessing. But anyway, presumably this is a game that goes on all the time. If the Ukrainians know that some of their communications are being decrypted, presumably they try to re-encrypt them using different systems. The Russians, for their part, will be busy trying to crack any codes that the Ukrainians are using in response to all of this. So there's probably a constant game of this going on. But one gets the sense that the Russians are able to bring to bear enormously greater resources. And if the Russians are listening in to Ukrainian communications at whatever level, that must give them a pretty accurate idea of where the Ukrainian forces are, and that presumably would make it more difficult for the Ukrainians to launch any particular surprises in any particular direction. Last but not least, yesterday we were pointedly informed that the Russians have launched another satellite system, one which apparently has some kind of radar array which enables the Russians to locate and map particular objects in Ukraine, military objects, some of which are only a meter in length. And we're told that the Russians now have a fair number of satellites operating over Ukraine, keeping track on what the Ukrainians are doing. And again, I would have thought that it would be very difficult, given the extensive surveillance capabilities that the Russians now have, for Ukrainians to really catch the Russians by surprise in any significant way. So there we go. That's the situation on the battlefronts. A very difficult month May has been for Ukraine. Perhaps tomorrow, last day of this month, we will see Ukraine make its move. We'll just have to wait and see. Meanwhile, there are some very strange things going on in the world of diplomacy. Now, in my recent videos, I discussed rumours which originated in the Wall Street Journal that Li Hui, Xi Jinping's emissary, who has been busy travelling in Europe and in Ukraine, anyway, that the Wall Street Journal said that Li Hui had told European leaders, the European officials that he'd communicated with, that the only way that this war could end would be for Ukraine to accept the loss of the 4 regions, accept the establishment of a demilitarized zone, and that the Europeans, for their part, needed to start to distance themselves from the United States, which has been driving this confrontation in ways that are proving negative for Europe. Anyway, yesterday we got denials of this story. But these denials came in a most interesting way, because they didn't originate in China. The Chinese government didn't come out immediately and say that Li Hui's, the Wall Street Journal story was completely false, that it wasn't based on anything at all that Li Hui had said. Nor, interestingly, did it come from European governments. You didn't get all kinds of reports from European governments saying that Li Hui had not said any of the things that the Wall Street Journal claimed that he had said.
The denials came essentially from Ukraine. The Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Dmytro Kuleba, reading these reports, apparently became extremely concerned. He phoned up European officials, European governments, not clear whether he tried to contact the Chinese themselves, and asked them whether it was indeed the case that Li Hui had been saying these things. And all of these officials, according to the Ukrainians, denied it. And the Chinese then ran with these denials. They piggybacked off these denials. They came out. They said that the Wall Street Journal, and by extension, by the way, the US authorities have been engaging in grave disinformation, and that in fact, Li Hui obviously would never have said the things that he did say. Well, I'm going to say here that I am a little more skeptical. Perhaps Li Hui chose his words very carefully indeed, as Chinese diplomats actually do. The story that they're all wolf warriors who come out and say whatever they want in the most aggressive terms has no connection to reality, in my opinion. But I think that he did probably, at the very least, give some pretty clear hints that Ukraine would have to recognize the territorial realities. So it could be that somebody in Washington who was worried about Li Hui's diplomatic activities set out to ruin his mission by perhaps making Li Hui's comments appear more concrete and more definite than they actually were. At the moment, he's only a mediator, or at least trying to position himself as a mediator. He's not coming out and saying, he's not actually promoting a particular peace plan. I've always said that the idea that China has offered a peace plan is actually wrong. The Chinese have never produced a peace plan to end the conflict in Ukraine, but they have spoken of themselves as potential mediators. But anyway, I wonder whether that was what actually happened, that the Americans tried to basically stop Li Hui's mission by inflating the words that he actually used. But I still suspect that this isn't that far from what the Chinese might be actually thinking. And I noticed that Zelensky himself has made further comments today in which he said that China is not an ally of Ukraine. It's not on Ukraine's side in this conflict. He's spoken about China in a way that seems to suggest that China does in fact tilt more to Russia. And interestingly enough, he's gone further and said that China isn't really a suitable mediator in this conflict. So anyway, there we go. But there are other sources in the European media. The Italian newspaper La Repubblica is saying that, is repeating reports discussed by myself and my colleague Alex Christoforou on the Duran, touched on in previous programs here on this channel, that the United States is looking to freeze the conflict in Ukraine, that they might be prepared to, or might be proposing to Ukraine that it accept some territorial losses, including, most importantly, the loss of Crimea and no doubt Donbass, in return for perhaps EU membership, or conceivably even NATO membership. And La Repubblica is essentially confirming that, or at least is also saying that this does seem to be the plan at the moment. So the idea is let the Ukrainians launch their offensive. If the offensive is successful and regains ground, well, that will put you in a better position to negotiate with the Russians. If it fails and Ukraine is defeated or repelled or suffers heavy losses or finds itself in a critical position, well, then you can turn around and tell the Ukrainians, well, enough's enough. We've done for you all you can. Clearly, you're not able to defeat the Russians despite all the equipment that we're providing to you. So what you must do is sit down and talk to the Russians and accept that you're going to lose some territory. But if you do that and we have peace, then you can join the EU and perhaps in time NATO as well. So that, it seems to me, is quite plausibly what the United States might be thinking about. So we have those discussions, I suspect, going underway. Intrigues around Li Hui's mission, thinking in Washington about some way of freezing the conflict in order to prevent it ending in some kind of debacle. And that perhaps brings me back to the comments from Josep Borrell. Now, Josep Borrell, who has been a consistent hardliner in this conflict, he has made some really very interesting comments at an expert forum in Barcelona, which is, I believe, his native city. Anyway, he said, I see the clear will of Russia to win in the war. Russia will not negotiate until it wins. I am not optimistic in my expectations about how this conflict may develop in the summer. And he said that the only right thing to do in the circumstances is for the EU to continue building up its military assistance to Ukraine. That's the only thing he can come up with, his only real solution going forward. Now, I find these very interesting comments, and I have to say that it seems to me that obviously they're addressed to the participants in this expert forum, but I'm no doubt that Borrell knows or knew when he made them that they would be widely publicized. And to me, they look to be an attempt to push back on these freezing the conflict ideas that appear to be circulating in Washington. What Borrell is basically saying is, look, I too understand that this offensive that Ukraine may be about to launch isn't going to improve things in any significant way. Things in Ukraine, in fact, are going from bad to worse. But it is unrealistic to think that the Russians are interested in freezing the conflict. They are now determined to win, and they think they can win, and they have no incentive to negotiate until they have visibly won, at which point, of course, they will dictate terms. So in this situation, our only option, unless we are prepared to capitulate to the Russians and or to cut Ukraine loose, is to go on supplying Ukraine with more and more weapons and more financial aid to try to keep them fighting, to keep them going, even if the offensive fails and the Russians continue their advances. To continue, in other words, doing what we've been doing ever since February 2022, in the hope that somehow, somewhere, at some point, things will turn out right for us. It's desperate, and one can understand why Borrell is not optimistic. But there is also, I have to say this, a grain of realism here, unusual with Borrell, because I think he is right. I cannot see what incentive Russia has to agree to the theories, the ideas that some people in Washington seem to have. Why would the Russians agree to freeze the conflict simply so that the West, having frozen the conflict, can build up Ukraine, integrate it into the European Atlantic system, and perhaps at some point in the future hope to launch it again in its campaign to reintegrate the territories it claims to its east? I cannot see why the Russians would do that, and I don't frankly think they are doing it. Anyway, that's my take of the situation in and around Ukraine at the moment. We could be on the brink of this offensive if Ukraine promised the Western powers that it would launch this offensive in May. Then, as I said, it's only got 1 day left. Perhaps it will launch it later in June. We shall see. I know there are some people who think that Ukraine won't launch an offensive at all. I have to say that I don't agree with them. I think that there will be an offensive. The only question is when, and of course what happens when it is indeed launched. But in the meantime, to repeat again, point I've made now many times in this program, May has been a very, very hard year for Ukraine, and the mood overall appears to be bad. We see people like Borrell no longer optimistic. We see Zelensky. Well, I've already said what I thought, that he might be depressed. We've seen Zelensky keen to be out of Kiev for as long as possible. And we see now the Russians starting to make launch strikes against decision-making centers. And by the way, even as I've made this video, I've seen a report that Putin himself has said that the facility, the decision-making center that was attacked in Kiev, was the headquarters of Ukraine's military intelligence, which is of course the agency which is headed by Budanov, who, it must be said, appears to have been uninjured and perhaps wasn't caught up in this strike. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about Ukraine. There are other things going on in the world, and of course we now have more problems in the Balkans. There's been an attempt by the authorities in Pristina, the capital of Kosovo, Kosovo being a province of Serbia that has broken away with the support of the Western powers, and which the Western powers recognize as an independent state, but which most of the world refuses to so recognize. They still consider it part of Serbia. And I should say that I too personally, I want to make my own views about this clear, I also consider Kosovo to be legally a part of Serbia, at least until there is a fair political settlement of this conflict, which takes into account the feelings of all of the communities, of which for the moment there is no sign. Anyway, the authorities in Pristina have, over the course of April, conducted what they called elections in the Serb-populated areas of Kosovo. The Serb people in these areas refuse to recognize those elections. As far as they're concerned, such elections, arranged by a secessionist authority, have no validity in the part of Kosovo which they occupy. The only legal authority they recognize, the only sovereign legal authority they recognize, is the one in Belgrade. And the result was that the turnout in these so-called elections was microscopic in the single figures, but the government in Pristina claims that certain officials, mayors, were elected and over the last few days it's tried to impose them, tried to leverage them into position. And of course, Serbs in these areas where these mayors are being imposed, I think that is the right word, have protested. These protests have escalated, and they've escalated into attacks on NATO, or at least KFOR peacekeepers drawn from the Western countries, all of which, of course, support Kosovo's independence, which to my mind calls into question whether they are can be properly described as peacekeepers. The Serbs, of course, would say that they're an occupation authority. Anyway, this has led to, as I said, fights and ugly incidents of that nature. But the response of the Western powers to all of this, to these events, has been very interesting. Because up to this point, pretty much anything that the authorities in Pristina have done, the Western powers have tended to support, in fact, have strongly supported. After all, the Western powers recognize the authorities in Pristina as the legitimate government of Kosovo. And it is, let's be clear about this, the Western-backed government of Kosovo, whose independence is, of course, also Western-backed. Anyway, this time we've had statements from Western officials that it's most inappropriate for Pristina to try to impose these mayors, take unilateral measures to try to impose these mayors on a community which does not consent to have these mayors imposed upon them. In other words, almost the first criticisms by the Western powers of the authorities in Pristina that I can remember. And I can't help but wonder whether all this is connected in some way with a darkening mood about the situation in Ukraine, with the situation in Kosovo, again, escalating, with the Serbian government having to take steps to support people, Serb people in Kosovo, with pressure from the Serb population in Serbia itself to support these people in Kosovo. The very last thing, it seems to me, at the present time, with the conflict in Ukraine going so badly wrong, is for the last thing the West wants is another conflict in the Balkans, which, as my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou on the program we did on this topic for the Duran correctly said, might only highlight divisions within the West, with some Western countries, Greece, Romania, Spain, several others, supporting Serbia against Kosovo and, in effect, breaking ranks with the rest of the West. So, a complex situation in the Balkans, an escalating situation in the Balkans, one where, it must be said, the Western powers sow the dragon's teeth, and a darkening mood and a darkening picture, at least from a Western perspective, about the conflict in Ukraine. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon. In the meantime, let me remind you that you can find all of our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can also check out our shop and buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. That's me for today. Please remember, check the like button, press the like button if you like this video. Check your subscription to this channel. More from me soon. And until then, have a very good day.